Okay. Hi, Perry. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, I was looking at your bio. You've got a book out called Taking Flight, Essential Information for Students with Disabilities. Let's talk a little bit about, before we get right into the book, let's talk a little bit about the concept of disability because when I was looking at that, I wasn't sure if you were talking about physical disability or mental or both. What
Right.
exactly are you
Right.
referring to?
Well, it's interesting. You know, one of the chapters in the book actually is sort of looking at and examining this idea of disability a little bit more, and it can be a very loaded term for a lot of people. Oftentimes, people who have disabilities don't feel like it's a disability until the world gets in their way. In fact, I did a whole podcast just sort of on that topic. And so, my preference is to speak to people as diverse learners. And I think that that's just sort of this catch-all. In fact, we use the term diverse learners and non-traditional students primarily because we think it applies to most people, or could apply to a lot of people. And so that could be whether they have a learning disability or social communication challenge, or they have a reading challenge, or possibly a physical disability. Visual or hearing impairment. It doesn't really matter. It's just about someone who identifies as somebody who learns differently. And like I said, I spend some time in the book just sort of talking about that. I think people get really hung up on the word disability, especially professionals and untrained teachers and professors, because the assumption is that if we know what the disability is, then we can do something about it. And knowing what the disability is probably in many ways the least useful information when we can gather. It's all of those strengths and challenges and all those pieces that make someone the unique person who they are, and that's so much more important for people to identify and recognize than the actual, what we might call the disability according to like the DSM. So the idea was to try to try to just reach out to people who identified that way, not necessarily were diagnosed that way.
Well, I know that there's been a lot of progress made in the last 40 years with identifying various types of learning challenges for people. Because I can remember when I was in school, I'd never even heard of ADHD. I don't think they had that around. People just said that they were hyperactive students
Hmm.
or poor behavior or something like that, something very not very specific. I don't think there were drugs that they were giving kids. I do not remember any of that when I was in elementary school or high school. There seems to be a lot of them now. There seems to be a lot
Hmm.
of different sort of categories. In your book, are you suggesting that at university level that they're not really as well adapted to handle these types of students as they probably should be?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. I mean, we certainly the universities and colleges are catching up to the primary schools, the K-12 schools. I mean, I think the teacher education training program, I was a professor and taught future special educators. And that field has really embraced this idea of addressing the learner, that actually the teaching isn't necessarily the most important part of what you do as a teacher. It's inspiring learning. And so, how do we address each individual learner and respect them as learners and teach them how to learn? And so, rather than a teacher being someone who has the information and then they give it to somebody, the idea is that you're creating students who can go out and find that information and use the teacher or the professor as a resource. And I think that just by nature, colleges haven't necessarily made that switch. There's certainly a push in that direction, but for people who are trained for 4 or more years to become a teacher, and they can really dig into those pedagogical practices and refine their teaching and think about it on a daily basis. I mean, I spent, my entire career thinking about teaching. You can't take someone who's spent their entire career thinking about biology and in one day teach them how to be an excellent teacher. And so I think that that's where colleges are having a hard time meeting the demand of these diverse learners and non-traditional students who are and students with disabilities who are coming up through the ranks more prepared for learning because that's how they've been treated for the past 12 years of their life. And then they get to college and the college has more traditional tutoring, academic supports and services without really having them to have the opportunity to focus on how do they learn as individuals, coming together with those plans. And And in some ways, it's sort of like the colleges are a wild west in some ways. I mean, in high school, people had this whole team around them, supporting them and coming up with ideas and helping them problem solve and coordinating those services across the high school. You get to college, and it completely flips directly to the student suddenly, where the student is the one that has to advocate for their needs. And if they have parents, they can try, but at the end of the day, it's a student has to walk into a professor's office, or a student has to go to the dean's office and advocate for themselves. And so it's just a huge switch, especially for students who are, non-traditional or diverse learners.
Well, I can remember as a freshman, some of the classes the required classes, the core curriculum, there could have been 250 people in the class in a huge auditorium. And
Right.
one professor, and it was
Mm-hmm.
like, the Roman Colosseum sort of setup,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you adapt that sort of an environment to specific needs of students? Because you've got so many, you can't possibly address all of the specific issues that students may have.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to enabling and empowering the learner. I went to the University of Wisconsin, so I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I was in 300-person biology lectures, and fortunately, I was someone who was able to learn and seek out support outside of the course. I mean, I think professors and universities have to rethink how they're doing those and what kind of supports they're offering to help those students, whether they're smaller labs or more study groups or smaller groups of instruction or outside resources that they're offering those students. Because again, lecture is one part of learning. It's not all of it. And so the idea behind the book is, how do we give students those strategies and ideas to manage a 300-person lecture, and how do they seek out their resources and supports on campus? Can they go to the math lab? Can they go to the writing center? Can they, go to the tutoring center? Can they get the notes? Can they meet with the professor? I mean, all those different tools to help overcome that. But then there's just a realistic part of the book, and that's the question of, like, is that right for you? I mean, the idea of, like, I want to go to University of Wisconsin because the Badgers are the best is one thing. Am I the kind of learner that can handle a 300-person lecture? And if the answer to that is probably not, then why not think about a smaller college or a community college to get all those prerequisites done, so that they can transfer back into the college and have a better shot at getting through those things. So thinking of college as the overall experience, and I use a lot of examples in the book where it doesn't mean that you have to start at the university where you end up. That college is about making decisions in the moment and what's right for you. And if that means supplementing some of the really difficult college courses with some of the smaller level, more supportive community college courses to get you through it, the degree is what matters in the long run.
What about online learning for the learning challenged students? I think that should be a
Yeah,
positive way to go. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of a double-edged sword. And it really depends upon the individual, because I can't speak to all disabilities, but certainly for students who have struggle learning independently, a lot of time that has to do with executive functioning. And so, when you have an online course, and I've taught a bunch of online courses, there's just some more expectation of the responsibility to be on the student. And so, where you're going to have to schedule your own time, especially if it's not a lecture that is, a pre-recorded lecture that you can do it at any time. And that really makes people have to think about that scheduling piece. So it can be really, really challenging, and you don't have that interaction of other students in the class. There may not be the motivation of going to class because you're not getting into that social benefit of sitting in a room with a bunch of your same age peers. And so it can be good. I mean, it really depends on the individual. I think unfortunately, the common myth is that it was better for students with disabilities, and I don't think that that's true whatsoever. I think that it could be good for some people, and it could be really terrible for other people.
Well, you're right about online. And when I hear the words online and double-edged sword put together in the same sentence, you can apply that to almost every genre that's
Hmm.
out there, from music to
Right.
movies to podcasts to everything. It's cut both
Right.
ways. And so
Yep.
to hear it
Absolutely.
for educational, I would agree with you. Absolutely.
Hmm.
We've got time for one of your talking points, and I just see this one here. I'll throw it out and see what you have to say. Roommate relationships.
No. Oh, there's lots of things to talk about there. I mean, I think what I would want to talk about is that the college, and I'll swing this back around to roommate relationships. Don't worry. Is college is a whole experience, and I think that that's where a lot of people miss out on that. I mean, when I talk to parents, when I do big trainings, the first question I ask is, what was the most important thing you learned in college? And like no parent ever says anything about what they learned in class. They talk about developing my social skills or meeting the love of my life or learning to have fun or developing world perspective or whatever it was. But when you ask those same parents, what do you want your kids to get out of college, they're much more academically focused. And so that the problem with that is that when we see a student who's struggling in college, the first place we generally go to is that, oh, the class might be too hard or the content is too difficult. And I think that's the last place to look. Quite honestly, I think there's so many other things in the college experience that support a student, whether it's being engaged on the campus or their independent living skills or their sleep hygiene. Are they getting internships and volunteering experiences? Are they doing the things that support the learning, that make it so that they're able to learn more? So, I mean, I think roommate relationships are just like one of those pieces on the long, long list of things that people actually have to think about. Certainly students who might have some social communication challenges. Now you're stuck in a little tiny box with someone else living across the floor from you, and you literally are coexisting with that person. And how are you going to make those steps to think about that relationship so that it fuels your life rather than steals away your energy? And so I think just overall, and that's what the book is really trying to do, is just kind of say, let's think of college as a holistic experience and be really intentional about what we can do and what a student can do in order to give them the best chance of doing well in college. And that's, quite frankly, it's as much of a problem not to have enough fun in college as it is to have too much fun in college. And I think that students need to know that and think about that before they go.
Well, I think anybody who's seen Animal House probably
Right.
sees that side of
That's too much. That's probably a little too much fun.
too
But you know
much
what? I
fun.
mean,
Yeah.
striking the right balance is better.
When I was in college, I lived off campus, so I didn't have that experience of being in a roommate situation. I lived alone. When you go and live in the dorms, do you get a choice of your roommate at all, or are you just assigned to somebody?
It's you can request. I mean, it's every college is different. I mean, but there's some new neat algorithms that's like dating sites that will
Oh,
like
okay.
match you with your roommate based on
Yeah.
your common interests, and so they try to put people together who have similar interests. But I mean, dating websites are not everyone who meets their first mate gets married to them, and so there's still going to be conflicts. And even if you like the person, it's a marriage while you're living in college with somebody across the floor from you. And it's especially a different challenge for students with all sorts of different disabilities. I mean, take autism, for example. There are tons of really bright, intelligent, wonderful people with autism who just have a different level of communication challenges and trying to think about how they're going to be in a room with somebody where those challenges are going to be front and center at all times, and making decisions about if that's right for them or what kind of roommate do they want or how do they disclose that or how do they make sure that they're having a boundaried relationship with that roommate.
Well, I'm glad to hear that at least the universities are making an effort to kind of match people who at least could be compatible rather than
Hmm.
just throwing everybody's name in a hat and saying,
Right.
okay, you're with this one, and that could be a disaster.
Yeah, there's a lot of like University of Vermont. It has a wonderful. They have sort of these learning and living communities where you can opt into a certain learning and living community based on your interests. And so, for example, one of the ones they have is like a wellness learning and living community where the students agree not to drink or use drugs. They agree to do a certain amount of yoga and exercise. And so even in that situation, you have people who are geared towards a certain living environment where they might find other people who have really similar interests or similar values. That goes across different subject areas or different athletics, but still a little bit more of an opportunity for someone to kind of choose a type of people they want to be around in a positive way.
Well, we do have to wind this down. My guest is Perry LaRoque. Your book is called Taking Flight. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, most of the information, including the book and my podcast, where I was able to interview Temple Grandin amongst a bunch of other just amazing individuals, is at www.perrylaroque.com, and that's LAROQUE. And there's a lot of other goodies on there and some videos, and so yeah, check it out, and get in touch if you have any questions.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show and telling us about your book.